This is Danny Haiphong, and you are tuning into the Left Lens. I'm going to talk to you just for a few minutes today about why COVID 19 shows that socialism is equal to a victory for workers, while capitalism spells defeat. And the COVID 19 pandemic has laid bare the contradictions of capitalism. Just this morning, the Washington Post reported that the Bureau of Labor Statistics have calculated the recent unemployment numbers in the United States at 14.7%. Now, we know that over 20 million people have filed for unemployment, at least what we know in terms of the botched numbers and the very difficult numbers to calculate given the chaotic unemployment system in the United States. We also know that this number is likely low. And why is that? Well, a lot of low wage workers, discouraged workers, and the so called underemployed are not counted in these figures. And so we have to take them with a grain of salt. We know also that unemployment tends to be 1.5 to 2 times higher for black workers and other oppressed nations. So we know that these numbers have to be taken with a grain of salt, but they're devastating nonetheless, and point to the fact that the capitalist class has responded to the COVID-19 pandemic by generating a economic crisis that rivals and will surpass the devastation of the Great Depression. On the other hand, you have the capitalist class also talking about reopening the economy. And this should be a concern for many, especially vulnerable people, working class people, and the oppressed. Because if the United States decides on a state by state basis to reopen the capitalist economy, this virus will spread like wildfire once again. Despite these half measures that have been taken, there has been little curb of the spread here in the United States. It has been a very slow process, and the United States is still far behind, and likely hundreds of thousands of people are going to die from the virus when this is all said and done. At this time, we don't know what all said and done really means. And this should not be a source of fear, but of great concern. And that our biggest concern as a class, as the working class, is to ensure that the vulnerable, the oppressed, the working class is protected. And we need to demand of our government more than what has been so far presented by the Trump administration's putrid response, as well as the Democratic Party's unwillingness to serve any other political section of the country other than the Wall Street and military industrial complex. So we have to look at the devastation, of course, that has been wrought by the COVID-19 pandemic, and that is a product of capitalism. The for-profit character of capitalism, the fact that workers are becoming more and more expendable under this latest stage of capitalism here in the United States and the Western world. And we also have to look at how capitalism is antagonistic to the needs of the working class. We have to analyze the social relations that make this possible. We have to understand that unemployment is an inherent part of capitalism, that unemployment is a product of the suppression of working class wages, and that wages themselves are a product of surplus value extraction, and how all capitalist profits ultimately come back to the exploitation of labor, whether it's here in the United States or we're talking about labor around the world. Then we have to look at the alternatives that have done so much better than the United States in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Who are these countries? What are these countries? What do they stand for? And what have they done? Let's just talk about China first. China right now has eliminated the domestic cases of COVID-19 to a standstill. There has been very little spread of the virus since the end of March. There has been a complete and utter misinformation campaign waged against China in order to demonize the country that has really set the best example of how to address a new crisis that was not really understood before before the virus was spotted in Hubei province back in late December. So we have to look at how China, a country of 1.4 billion people, is reporting under 5,000 deaths in the country and is now not looking toward reopening the economy for the sake of capitalist profit, but is really looking to take a step-by-step slow containment process to reopen the economy in a way that serves the interests of the majority, those who really do control society in China, which is the workers, the peasants, those folks who in 1949 overthrew the landlords, the oligarchs who had basically tethered themselves to the West, to the imperialist core, and sold the country down the river. Now, the situation is different, and China is showing how a revolution, a socialist revolution, can build the infrastructure necessary to ensure that people's needs are met, whether that is people's needs for food while they're quarantining, whether it is people's needs for protective equipment to ensure that they do not contract the virus, whether it is the need to ensure that folks do not lose their homes, that the government is the landlord, not private corporations. All of this is so important to understand when looking at how China succeeded in containing the virus, how China came together in a centralized way to send tens of thousands of doctors to Hubei province to assist with overwhelmed hospitals and medical facilities, and then also how state-owned corporations as well as private corporations were mandated to build hospitals and to focus all of their efforts on containing the virus and redirecting productions for PPE. All of this is so important to understand, and Vietnam learned. So Vietnam is another huge example, a socialist country with a market economy that learned from China's response, took China's response very seriously, saw this as a problem all the way back in January, began taking measures for strict quarantining if folks showed any indication of the virus, and also waged a massive education campaign, slowed the economy to a hilt so that people were protected. And Vietnam has done very well, 0 deaths. We can also look at Venezuela, which I talk about in my latest article for Black Agenda Report. Venezuela has about 10 deaths up until this point, and it has instituted a social quarantine, which means that people voluntarily are staying in their homes, they are getting their basic needs met, that workers are being paid and small businesses are being paid by the government, that there is this form of relief that exists in Venezuela so that family doctors, tens of thousands of doctors, are deployed to neighborhoods to monitor symptoms, provide tests, as well as to survey the population to see just how far and wide the virus has spread. And this has been very successful, and this was instituted on March 16th. So when we look at these countries, Venezuela, China, and Vietnam, we see what's possible when socialism is in command of society, when the workers and the people's needs are in command of society and politics, not the private profits of the very few. The situation is the opposite in the United States. That is why we have such high unemployment numbers, and there's no sign of any relief coming our way. Workers are struggling, they're desperate, they don't have a means of income. We have right-wing forces exploiting this situation, acting like they are acting in the interests of the working class, storming the Capitol building in Michigan to demand the economy be reopened so that they can have their jobs back, supposedly. But this isn't the principal contradiction here that they are waging. That is an electoral move. We know that the Trump administration, the Republican Party, and their big donors have funneled money into these demonstrations, and that these demonstrations do not represent the grassroots. There was just a study released today as well, and I'll link it in the video, that shows that the reopening of the economy is actually a huge concern for working people, and that most folks, especially I guess on the Democratic Party line, but even many Republicans as well, are concerned about reopening the economy. They're concerned about the safety of working people. They're concerned about their own safety. And this is a legitimate danger that everyone should be heeding, but especially our class. The capitalist class, on the other hand, they have other desires. Really, their interests are rooted in the extraction of surplus value, the expansion of empire. What we are seeing is that the United States continues to bomb Iraq at record numbers, that a coup attempt was just attempted in Venezuela, and that the aggression towards China, this rhetoric, this anti-China rhetoric, is now being materialized into real policy that could have very large economic and military implications for the world, and it will only spell a defeat for the working class. So, in effect, a society that is really run in the interests of workers and oppressed people exists. It exists in Venezuela, it exists in China, it exists in Vietnam. Now, these countries may not look exactly how so-called pure socialists, these so-called forces who want to equate the Chinese Communist Party, for example, with the ruling classes in the United States, in Europe. These forces who want to demonize Vietnam's attempt to develop their society after being bombed to oblivion by the United States, the French, the Japanese, and the British over the course of just under a century, to rebuild their economy in a way that will ultimately not only meet people's needs, but raise the standard of living. This has to be understood as a key component of socialism. One cannot have a socialist society that is underdeveloped and impoverished. And the reason for this is because an underdeveloped and impoverished society will never be able to maintain the gains that it has won from defeating imperialism. So Cuba, Venezuela, China, we can go down the line. All of these countries came from a very underdeveloped position as an super exploited country. And if they remain super exploited in terms of the material conditions, meaning if sanctions and other provocations are allowed to keep them poor, then ultimately unrest about socialism will occur. Generational divides will sow defeat for socialism. And this is what Cuba, this is what the DPRK, this is what China and Vietnam are always thinking about. How do we pass the revolution on from one generation to the next? How do we ensure that each generation lives better than the one beforehand? We have to remember that China is a developing country, Vietnam is a developing country, Cuba is a developing country, Venezuela is a developing country. All of these countries have started from a place of defeat, okay? So all of the provocations against them, the war aims of the United States, the attempted coup attempt by this Silver Corps private mercenary company against Venezuela, the continued sanctions that have rendered Venezuela in a very difficult position economically. Or how about the fact that the United States continues to try to contain and isolate China and Vietnam from each other and around the world, and that it has taken opening up and reforming their own economies in order to sustain the revenues and the development needed to meet the needs of a majority impoverished population. That is why poverty has reduced so much in China and in Vietnam. And that is why now they have the infrastructure to be able to address something like a pandemic. It should be seen as impressive. We should be learning from it. We should not be demonizing these efforts. In conclusion, I think it's important to know that if we are going to defeat the COVID-19 pandemic and if we're going to defeat capitalism, we have to move in the direction of socialism. That Vietnam and China are so successful because the Communist Party is in command, because this party represents the interests of the people, and that this party ultimately would fall tomorrow if it were to betray the interests of the people. That these struggles that occur within the party are very important, that we see the multi-directional basis of the Communist Party, that it is not a monolithic entity, that there is always a conversation and a debate happening, and that democracy is not the private property of the United States and West. Actually, it never existed for anyone else except for the capitalist class in these countries. And we are seeing that with the COVID-19 pandemic. We are seeing the repressive apparatus come down on black people still being gunned down in the streets. We've seen this recently, and we're going to continue to see it. We're going to continue to see people like Joe Biden be propped up, folks who are responsible for the mass incarceration regime, the mass surveillance regime, being propped up, while the United States wages war against any country that dares to stand up to its exploitative and oppressive system. This is what's happening around the world. This is the world situation. And we know that private profit, the massive accumulation of private profit, the capitalist relationship between workers and the bosses, that this is the fundamental contradiction that we need to now understand at this very moment is the biggest problem set before us. That the COVID-19 pandemic has only helped us see better, even as it ravages our communities. So let's defend Venezuela, let's defend Vietnam, and let's defend China. Let's begin to learn lessons from their example and organize our own alternatives right here in the United States and in the imperialist core. You have been watching The Left Lens with Danny Haiphong. Please follow me on YouTube, on Facebook, on Twitter, and please subscribe to the page.